first one is a little bit miscompleting.
Well, I just tested it on LinkedIn Live and it works, so we're all good.
Welcome everyone to the Wisconsin.net user group. We're going to have a talk about integrating Azure SignalR Service into C#. Thanks for being here. We have Zach, who's going to be coming online shortly, and he'll be doing the talk on. Hello, Zach, you ready?
Born ready.
All right. Thank you, Zach.
All right, let me switch over.
Here.
All right, and you can see the second screen now, right?
Yes, we can see the second screen.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you all very much for having me at your event. This is about the farthest north of Kansas City that I typically venture, but it's okay. It's a little cold this year. I'm, if you don't know me, I am the chief architect here at Keyhole Software. We're a software consulting shop based here in Kansas City, but we have projects from pretty much the West Coast to the East Coast and everything in between. And healthcare and banking, utilities, transportation, entertainment, pretty much every place that you can put an application in front of a user, we're in some space around it. I, along with about 100 other people at Keyhole Software, we're all based in the US. We average, I think, about 10 or 12 years of experience just in the industry, and our average tenure is about 4.5 years, which is about 4 years more than most other firms. We got started in 2008, a very interesting year to start a business. And we really found our niche, helping people connect their users to their data. And I personally have been developing software since I was 14, and there's a lot of things that, you probably can't tell because of the stream, but I have a few gray hairs, not as many as I would like, but I have a few. I seem to get more every day. And this presentation came out of work that I do for a hospital out of New York City. It was a very interesting time during COVID-19. It's still around, it's still with us. We were doing go lives with them, every single week, it seemed. And there were some things that we ran into that we kind of wanted to take a step back and figure out, is this really the right way that we should be doing things. And thankfully, you all don't have to go through all of the things that I tried to do that didn't work. You actually get to see the one thing that did work. So to get it started with, the best way to kind of think through this is to start out in the beginning of web development. I mean, I'm going back to when, I had many fewer gray hairs. Things were relatively simple. We had a client, which would be someone sitting on, in their house, and then we had a server. And the client was always requesting data from the server, but it was an entire web page. You click on a hyperlink, you get the whole page sent to you. And for a long time, that model worked really well until we got to the point where we could have a bit more complexity in our applications. And around the time that I really started to get into web development, Google Maps came out. And that totally changed the game. Like if you're into philosophy, this is the Immanuel Kant of web development. It's everything after is completely different. With Google Maps, they took advantage of AJAX, which, if you didn't know, stands for Asynchronous JavaScript as XML. Well, the funny part is that nowadays we don't really use XML when we do AJAX, but the terminology stuck because AJ, it just doesn't roll off the tongue as well as AJAX. But what it allowed us to do is still take that same mental model of having a client and a server, but instead of requesting, the whole page, they were able to request individual pieces of it and pull just what was needed in real time for that section. Now, I, as a web developer, have been using AJAX for years, and it is an extremely powerful tool. There are some gotchas, don't get me wrong, but it's a really, really good tool for 90, 95, maybe even up to 98% of things that we have to do in the web development world. Where it struggles is in some very niche use cases. And it's funny, I was actually talking to someone about this earlier today. If you have a job that needs to run for a very long period of time, AJAX really isn't good for that. AJAX is meant to be for short, sort of point to point, maybe less than 5 or 10 or 15, probably even shorter than that, honestly, if you're talking about, Nielsen Group performance ratings. Very, very short, very direct communication. It's not good at keeping a long transaction open. Some of the people that I talked to today said they had to have a power supply backup on their computer so that even if there was a power shortage in the building, their client, which initiated the AJAX request, wouldn't suddenly abort and then cause the server to stop this transaction when it was maybe like 59 minutes in and it took an hour to run. So not good for those sort of long running transactions. Something else that I did early on in my career was reports. Reports by their very nature can take some time to run, and they're often very ad hoc. They let you customize what fields you're searching by, what you're sorting by. And if you get a report that takes a really long time to load, well, I mean, you could do it through AJAX, but one of my favorite sayings is not all problems are nails. I could use my iPhone as a hammer, but I probably shouldn't do it. It's really not the best tool for the job. So when we were working with the hospital, one of the scenarios that came up is they would have call center agents that would be receiving phone calls from patients. And these were people that were calling in, very early on in COVID, wanting to talk through some of their symptoms. People just didn't know whether what they had was the sniffles or if you've had kids. I mean, kids are pretty much petri dishes. They will get anything and everything that can possibly happen. Do you know that's COVID or not? Well, I mean, you could Google it, but it's kind of nice to be able to talk through with an actual nurse that really understands what's going on. And then additionally, if there are campaigns that they have set up through the call center, a phone call comes in and you want to be able to immediately look up the patient demographics based on the phone number that they were dialing in from. Otherwise, the user, the call center agent, is wasting precious minutes sitting there typing in those demographics. Sounds good in theory, but how do you take a desktop-based application, which is what the phone calls came in as, and integrate that with what we traditionally do on the website, which is our C# side? Now, you could, theoretically, I wouldn't suggest it, but you could use AJAX and have something where when a phone call comes in, it writes a record to a database, and then you have an AJAX call that's periodically polling, maybe once every minute, once every 30 seconds, to see, are there any new calls for this user? Are there any new calls for this user? It's not very efficient because if you make that call, nothing returns, and then a phone call comes in, well, you've made them wait. So are you going to have them press a button to be able to bring up all those demographics on your screen? No, no, that would just be completely silly. So we looked at a couple different options, and the one that we ultimately landed on was SignalR. If you don't know what SignalR is, the best way to describe it is a bidirectional socket that you can have between two different parties. Now notice, I used very specific wording there because it's not always a client and a server. I mean, we think of our web browser as the client and then some VM or some app service as the server. But in SignalR, the way that it works is there are two different parties that, I mean, you kind of think about it like a phone call. You initiate that connection, and then people can just talk whenever they want. Now, there might typically be a flow of a back and a forth and a back and a forth, but the model of a client sending a request to a server and getting a response back from the server, that goes out the window. It is more akin to a UDP message where you send something off. There's not necessarily a guarantee of delivery. However, you can do a ton of traffic through it. And there's really two different ways that you can broadcast a message. And you can either go point to point saying, I received this phone call and it is this agent that picked up. I want to send a message to that agent with the information about the patient. That's probably one of the most common ones that we do. The other way of sending the message is to a group, to where maybe when our application boots up, all of the call center agents join a group saying, I'm a member of the call center. And if you want to send a message to an entire group, not to a specific user, you could send a message saying, anticipated downtime in 15 minutes, something like that. So it's not a AJAX or even backtracking, the good old days of AOL, we were all doing the Macarena, life was very simple. It's not that model where it's a client and server request and response. It is that you have two parties and one sends a message to another. So under the covers, it uses Websockets, and Websockets allow for that bidirectional communication. It has fallbacks built into it because not all most, I would say these days, web browsers do support WebSockets. However, if you're like me and you screw up setting up the cross-origin resource sharing on the web app, you can have it fall back to sort of lesser technologies. JSON-P being, I think, its very first fallback, which it's kind of like a really long-running HTTP request where it just sits there, it uses a pipe, and then the server can send messages to the client. JSON-P is not ideal because you're using one of those TCP sockets and you're just keeping that thing open. Even if there's no traffic going between those two entities, you're keeping that thing open, so you're using bandwidth, and it doesn't scale as well. So there are wrappers in pretty much any UI library that you want to use with SignalR. So they've made that very easy to customize and integrate inside your application. And it does have those kind of fallbacks. Now, of course, you are asking, well, WebSockets, I've heard of those before. There's many other possible choices that you could use for how to do bidirectional WebSocket communication. And to your point, that's true. I have some of the other offerings listed there. In our research, we saw that there was, in this chart, I would actually recommend anyone look at if you're ever comparing one versus another. This is like npmtrends.org, if I remember right. It lets you see all the different downloads of these different NPM packages. So you can kind of get an idea what the community is using. If you see any dips in it, you'll notice that there's a dip kind of around January. Well, the number of downloads typically takes a hit around Christmas time and New Year's because we're all too busy having fun on the holidays and there's not a ton of development that's going on. So ignoring those aberrations, this is a really good tool to see what is trending and what's not. And you'll notice SignalR is low. It's like nearly nothing. So normally, when I use this technique to evaluate different options, I try to stay away from whatever is the lowest downloaded one, which has served me well in the past. What I found with all of these other offerings and why I'm not presenting them to you today is that they really lack the support on the .NET side of being sort of first class, very easy to integrate, especially if you're doing .NET Core. It is dead simple to be able to integrate this, even from an authentication and an authorization standpoint, much less how do you actually implement it on Azure. The Azure SignalR Service is a first-class service. You know, it's not sort of the third-party marketplace. Like, it's something that they actually support. And support for me is a big thing. I want to spend more of my time developing functionality and features for the business use case that I am working on, and less time on purely engineering, purely technical problems. So the Azure SignalR service, as you can tell, has 3 different tiers to it. Honestly, I have maybe 35, 40 call center agents on a heavy day. I don't need a lot of the things that the premium and even the standard tier give. I think I have dev, QA, and UAT set up on the free tier, and then production set up on standard, you know, just in case. And you can see from the estimated pricing, it's $50 a month. I mean, we're not talking about anything crazy. This is not your new SQL Server priced per core licensing model at all. Now, if you need to, you can scale it. We have had clients that had Internet of Things applications that have used WebSockets before, and they needed lots and lots and lots of messages per day, lots and lots of connections, because they just have a lot of stuff that needs to travel on it. Whereas for our use case, you know, we kind of knew our users. This isn't something that went out to the general public. I would really shy away from using WebSockets on something that is available to the general public. I see this more as a B2B tool, honestly. There's so many things that could go wrong. Messages could get dropped. You're much better and you're going to have fewer headaches if you're focused more on sort of an enterprise application, more of a B2B standpoint than a B2C. So with SignalR, it is similar, I would say, to what you can send on an HTTP request in that you could send everything. The URLs that you come up with, you could do whatever URL scheme you want. And trust me, like, I have seen a lot of different people do a lot of different things with URLs. Some people like REST. Some people, like me, don't. We can get into that, you know, on later talks. So whatever you want your URL to be and whatever you want your payload to be, it's sort of up to you. When we got started with SignalR, we didn't really enforce any structure to it. And I wish we would have, because we paid for it down the road. So if you are going the SignalR route, one of the first things you want to do is have some sort of swagger page that you build. I mean, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the green swagger page that we know and we love, to where it lets us see our catalog of all of the different APIs that we could call, what the request structure needs to be, and what response structure we can look like. Unfortunately, SignalR doesn't have anything like that. So at bare minimum, when you want to document what are all the messages that are traveling back and forth, you have to put it at least somewhere. There are some cool things that you could build, and that's actually how I recommend people get their feet wet with SignalR, is to build your own sort of Swagger page where you can send off messages to a specific user, messages to a specific group, and that lets you get in without actually getting all the way in. So you could, if you wanted to, send XML over SignalR. It's 2023, we can put there are rovers right now running around on Mars. I think we don't need to use XML anymore. That's just me. That's just my personal opinion. Feel free to disagree. But we should be using JSON. Now, what you put in that JSON, I think, needs to have a bare minimum amount of structure. So whenever we publish a message onto SignalR, whether it be published from the web browser, as I didn't say client, web browser, or from our C# side, as I didn't say server, we have to include a correlation ID, which is just some GUID that you generate. What it allows you to do is log out that GUID when you're sending it, and then when you receive it, you can log that GUID. So you can track the message as it goes across your ecosystem. Every message also needs to include a topic. You can think of a topic sort of like a URL. It's more, I guess, like a URL plus the HTTP verb that you're using, to where it says, this is what I am talking about. Like the subject of an email. All good emails must have subjects, and all good emails must have a payload. They must have a body. So as long as whatever code you put in place that very lightly wraps SignalR, you still have to do a little bit of wrapping to tell it how to integrate with your authentication and authorization. Not a big deal. It's very straightforward to set up, and there's actually some sample code I have at the end. As long as you include those three things, then you're typically good. You're setting yourself up for success. And in terms of how the structure of it, I've kind of been dancing around it, but here is a little bit how it works. So thinking back to that screenshot I showed of the different options, in order to get SignalR working, the first thing you have to do is you have to have a SignalR Service resource deployed on Azure. You could theoretically have one non-prod and one prod SignalR service. I like to follow the 12-factor app architecture, so I like to have high degrees of parity between all my different environments. So I have whatever I have in development is the same thing as what I have in QA, same as prod, same as UAT. Now, the scale of those might be different because I don't need 60 cores in development, but it's still the same resource ultimately. So you'll have a SignalR service. Underneath that, you will have what's called a SignalR hub. So the entities, the parties, when they want to talk to each other, they can't talk to each other directly. They have to go up to a hub. Think of it like a cell phone tower. Like when I call my wife, I don't directly call her phone. I call a cell phone tower that knows her location. That's very much how the SignalR hub works. When a client connects to a hub, you have to write a little bit of code that says, this is who this person is, be it a domain ID or some GUID, something that consistently and uniquely identifies who the recipient is. That way, no matter which SignalR hub you hit, because you could potentially scale these things out, you could have one in East US, maybe closer to us in North Central US, you can horizontally scale these, and they have a backplane so that you can talk to someone on the other side of the country, potentially, even on the other side of the world, as long as those SignalR hubs have the notion of which user is connected on the other end of that connection. And in this case, my user interface is the one that is the client. So, not client, it's the uh, user behind that connection. I'll say it like that. So, sending a message and creating a hub is very, very straightforward. And there's a little bit more code than it takes on the C# side to do it than this, but it's not much. It's sort of dead simple. So imagine the use case I talked about earlier, where a phone call comes in. Information that we get from the application includes what phone number the person is calling in with, what phone number they called in to, as well as what the campaign is, and then which agent picked it up. So I have to do a little bit of translation outside of this that maps which agent corresponds to which user in my application. And when the browsers connect to the SignalR hub, they identify themselves by a GUID. That's their user ID. They get that when they log in. So when I want to send a message to a particular user, notice that my method is send message to user. It's not send message about incoming phone call to call center agent, because that is one example of a message that I might want to send. I might want to send another message to a user saying, hey, this different user has clicked on this particular chart, so that I make sure that two people aren't trying to look at the same thing at once. Or I might want to send a message saying, oh, this person has assigned themselves to this particular patient in the queue, and let everyone else know that this is now the patient that I claim. Similar messages, but you kind of get the idea. The abstraction is not the message that you're trying to send. The abstraction is that you're trying to send a message to a user. And whatever that message might be, that's the prerogative of the party that is sending the message. So that message string that I have right there, that is a JSON encoded string that, if you recall, contains the GUID of the correlation ID, the topic, and the actual message. So what this is doing is, first, it checks to see, well, is anyone even connected to the hub? And I'm on line 16, if you're following along. If no one is connected to the hub, then I can't send a message to anyone. It's like, log warning, sorry, I don't know who to talk to. Then I grab what client, and this is their parlance, this is not mine. I wish they would have used a better term than client. You can think of it as connection. So which connection is associated with this particular user? Now, it's entirely possible, and this is where it gets into the sort of these fun use cases that we've never had to consider before with AJAX. You could have a single user that has many different tabs open. It's the same user in all those particular tabs. And if all of those are connected to the same SignalR hub, they're all going to get the message. And how our users work, that's actually what they do. They have different tabs of our application open for different reasons. It makes it somewhat difficult on the JavaScript side. It's easy on the C# side. Don't get me wrong. This is actually a problem on the JavaScript side more than anything else. Because I could receive a message about anything at any time. In AJAX, life was very simple. Remember, Macarena, Backstreet's back all right. Things were very simple. When we initiate a request, we always know what context we are in inside the application. And there's a high degree of certainty, though it's not 100% certain, it's fairly certain, that when we get the response to that request, we're still on the same patient or on the same document or in the same place in the application. Whereas in this mentality, where we could just receive messages from the C# code essentially at any given time, we have to be able to respond to that. So there's another talk that I do, kind of the flip side of this, on how to do it on the JavaScript side. C# much more simple, thankfully. Your lives are very good in this particular respect. So we send a message to a particular user, and that's it. That's how we send messages from our C# side to potentially, it doesn't even have to be a JavaScript client. You could use SignalR to communicate between different C# services. Now, there's probably arguments for not doing that, and there's probably better ways of doing it, because we can do things like using Event Hub or Service Bus, and we wouldn't want that to be conflated with our APIs for performance reasons, but theoretically, you could do it. Now, one gotcha that I will give you, and I've talked about it a little bit, you have to tell SignalR how to do authentication and authorization. It supports a lot of the stuff like cookie-based or JSON Web Token based, but you have to give it a little bit of information, a little bit of configuration in your startup file. So this particular example is what I have to do on my side, to where I use JSON Web Tokens as the bearer token in all of my requests. And it has to listen for when requests get created to it where someone is connecting to the hub. It has to know how to grab that token from the query and put it in the correct location. So if you're using SignalR, this is actually an ebook that I'll post on the end. This is one of the things that you're going to run into immediately, because out of the box, it works and it's great, but unfortunately, it's not secure. So let's say, you're happy, you're thinking about what you want to name your beer after this, you're full of pizza, and you want to go home and you want to start tinkering around with SignalR. Once you get it up and running, if you actually open the dev tools, this is what you're going to see. The initial connection between your JavaScript and the SignalR hub, it's going to do a negotiate at first. This is where the query having the bearer token comes into play, because you have to give it that in order to authenticate the user. So I believe it's an AJAX request at first. Once it gets the AJAX response, it's going to tell it, okay, here's your SignalR service. This is your connection ID. You can connect to me on here. And then, if you'll notice, I changed what I'm filtering by in my Chrome DevTools tab. Normally, most of us filter by fetch/XHR, which under the covers is the technology that JavaScript is using. XML HTTP request. Again, it's very funny that we use JSON, but all the old terminology is XML based. It's legacy software. What are you going to do about it? One of the filters that I don't think a lot of people really use, because unless you're doing Websockets, you don't have any reason to do it, is doing that WS one. That lets you see all the messages that your browser has sent and all the messages that your browser has received. And what you'll notice is, as you're publishing messages back and forth, that the information that you'll see on there, it'll keep appending to it. So instead of going to our traditional AJAX tab, this is where you would actually go to see the traffic going back and forth. And it's really fun. I say that euphemistically. It's really fun to debug issues when you're trying to broadcast a message to a particular client, but it's never actually getting to your client, because the hub is the one that's really responsible for that. And if you screw up the code around how someone identifies themselves, how they give out their client ID, you're not going to see the message on the browser, because it's never going to make it there, because it's never going to route it to the right place. So having logging in place, the sample code that I showed earlier used just the native iLogger, is essential, because otherwise when you get this stuff set up, you're going to be pulling your hair out. And even if you're doing it for a while, you still might be pulling your hair out. Don't get me wrong. It's not as straightforward, I would say. And one of the things that I like to do too whenever I'm giving a presentation is let people know, like, all the stuff I've talked about is great. These are a lot of really like great reasons to use this particular technology. There are some gotchas that you have to be aware of if you're going to use this. And, just as a PSA, if anyone is doing a presentation on something and they don't tell you the hard parts, run, because they're trying to sell you something. I'm not being paid by Microsoft to give this talk. I mean, if they want to send me some Bitcoin, I'll send them my wallet address. But I'm here for you all. I'm here to spread the love, to spread the knowledge. So the first gotcha that I would give you: SignalR should not be a wholesale replacement for AJAX. It's a tool. And just like any tool, there is a right time and there is a wrong time to use that. I could use my hammer instead of my fingers to type on my keyboard. I would probably mash my keyboard to smithereens and destroy my laptop, but I could do it. It just wouldn't be very effective. When you have scenarios in web development where you have a very clear request, like load page or load list or save form, and you have a very clear response where you need a response code, a response body, use AJAX for it. Theoretically, you could use SignalR as a complete replacement for AJAX. I've seen it done. I wouldn't recommend anyone do it if you value your sanity. It's not what it's really meant for. It's meant for those really niche use cases, the ones where just AJAX isn't the right tool for the job. Along with that, along with having logging, you really have to know how many connections you have and how many messages you're publishing through. What you don't want to do is, for every use case inside your application, create a new SignalR connection. Because if you have 5 SignalR use cases, you're going to be creating 5 connections per tab load. And if you think about someone with 3 tabs open, how many users you have running concurrently, you're increasing your load, I think, 400%, just because you have a different connection per use case. What you want to do instead is, when an application boots up on the JavaScript side, and actually on the C# side as well, when you do need to send one of those messages, you want to create the connection and reuse it. It will eventually purge itself, just like anything else in a thread pool. So you have to look and see, like, oh, even if I have the connection, is it still active? If it's not, then reload it. You might want to do a little bit of thread safe locking with the Semaphore Slim. But honestly, it's really not that hard to create just a very simple sort of singleton wrapper, singleton usage of these SignalR connections. Otherwise, you're going to spend more time doing the connection and reestablishing it than you're actually doing beneficial work, and you're going to be paying for it because it's based on the number of connections and the number of messages. So once you're through those 2 hurdles, the next thing that you'll typically run into is you want to have some sort of standards in your application for how you publish messages. For the developers that I work with, probably one of the best tools that we have is we have an interface class that anyone can bring in using dependency injection. And that, when you want to publish the message, you give it the message. And then under the covers, the implementation of that interface, it automatically adds on, remember those 2 other properties, the correlation ID and the topic. It's probably better to pass in a topic, honestly, so it's really those 2 and then the correlation ID. But the fact that you're using SignalR is abstracted away from the things, the code, the classes that are actually calling to it. That's not to say that because you have it abstracted by an interface that somehow you're going to be able to replace wholesale SignalR with, I don't know, Signal S or Signal T or Signal U. Like that. When you get to the point where you want to use a completely different technology, it's probably good that you have that stuff in interface, but the impetus for that change typically means you want to use something completely different. And even if it can fulfill the same interface contract, you're probably going to do something else anyway, honestly. So still keep things in an interface, still keep it somewhat at arm's length, just as we do for anything else. For, you never want to create a vanilla HTTP client. Have some of that stuff abstracted away, have some base classes for it in your code base that you publish via your internal NuGet servers, just to make life simple for everyone else. And the last anti-pattern, it's more for those of us on the front end. Because you can receive any message at any time, JavaScript isn't great at that. C# actually is. I mean, when you think about it, that's like 90% of what we do, isn't it? We have these controller methods that can just get hit at any given time, and they need to know how to construct themselves. But it's different on the C# side because we persist our state to our database. We receive a request, do some processing on it, save the data to the database, maybe write an audit log, provide a response to the UI. In JavaScript, that's a lot harder because its state is persisted to the user, and it can't just monkey around with things, and it has to understand what's going on in the application when it receives that message. So at least how we handle it is we have state management. In React, we use MobX, Angular state management, Vue state management, anything else. The SignalR messages write to the state, and then we have things that react upon the state. That's really the easiest way to set it up. It's pretty difficult, honestly, if you were going to have a ton of SignalR use cases, just because anything could happen at any given time. And that mentality, that mind shift, is more so difficult than anything technical, honestly, that I have talked about. Just trying to work out with new developers what exactly our application is going to look like, which use cases are even appropriate, what types of messages are we going to put on there, what should be the content of the messages. It's almost like starting from scratch before you learned AJAX, before you even learned what like REST was. Your frame of reference is just so fundamentally different that it's such a new and different tool. It takes a while to get used to. And I wish I could offer a slide that provides everyone the one or two things that you need to know that will suddenly make you a great SignalR developer. It's like those ads that we see on the internet. If you want to be good at SignalR, try this one weird trick. Or, the government doesn't like it when you do this one weird thing with SignalR. Like, no, like there's no easy way around it. That's not a reason not to do it. That's a reason, at least I kind of enjoy stuff like that, maybe a little masochistic. I like learning new things. And this SignalR is a very, very powerful tool as long as you use it correctly. So one of the things, and I think I'll talk to Jason, see if I can provide this PowerPoint later. There's a link. I know you can't click it because it's like a screen. We haven't quite figured out how to link our brains up, though I'm sure Elon is working on that. But it's a free ebook that we provide to all of our clients that we're sending out to you all today as part of this presentation, that lets you understand how I have set up SignalR in the past. And I kind of go through all the different NuGet packages that I had to bring in, because there's no one, unfortunately, if there is someone from Microsoft listening, I wish we'd make this a little bit easier. There's no one single page you can go to that tells you all the different things that you're going to run into. Like, how do you set up authentication? How do you set up authorization? How do you invoke a SignalR hub from the C# code? How do you listen to it on the JavaScript side? There's no one page, unfortunately, that does that. And I even show in that ebook some Terraform scripts, which if you're not using Terraform, like, get on the bandwagon, drink the Kool-Aid. It makes life so much simpler. Or if you're using Kubernetes, that's fine. As long as you have some sort of implementation, some way to do CI/CD, like, that's totally fine. So I'm going to pause for 1 second. That's SignalR in a nutshell. Very, very powerful tool, allows for bidirectional communication. There's a lot of things that you can do with it. There's a lot of different ways that you can stumble into it. overall, would I recommend it? Yeah, totally. I think that it is an extremely powerful tool in certain scenarios. It's not perfect for everything. It's not a wholesale replacement of AJAX either. But in general, if you have these scenarios that come up where just AJAX calls aren't cutting it, that you can tell something is wrong because life should be slightly simpler, there is an answer. And there's a couple other tools, honestly, that you can use other than SignalR. Though I think in terms of the support that it has and how easy it is to get set up on Azure, as well as how easy it is to integrate in your C# code. I mean, you all saw it. There's nothing in my sleeves. Like, it truly is that simple. So would I recommend it for everyone? As long as you have a compelling enough use case and you think you can afford an extra $50 a month in production, like, absolutely go for it. And one of the things that I like to offer at the end of all my presentations is feedback, because if I were there in person, I would totally be eating the pizza with you all. I'd be drinking the beer, but unfortunately I have tea and I had some bacon pasta earlier, and that's okay. But I do want to know, what are some of the things that you found interesting with this presentation? What are some of the things that maybe I could cut out? Did I have too many references to how great life used to be in the 90s and early 2000s? Maybe. I have, I have pled guilty to that before in a court of law. Let me know what you think. And if you want the link to the ebook, I mean, certainly fill that out. It has a field on there that lets you fill out your email and just kind of let me know how I did, because I'm always looking to improve. I think software is one of those very few fields where we constantly have to be learning from each other. We constantly have to be pushing the envelope. And one of the things that I love about application development and Keyhole Software is that we have that mentality. We have that constant pushing, that constant learning. So many other fields that we work with, be it in hospitals or in teachers, they have continuing ed. And I think I congratulate you all actually on going out, spending time, part of your day, part of your beautiful Tuesday night, almost, we're this close to spring, but just learning about something new. And as long as you're always in that mentality of always pushing yourself, always learning something new, you'll look back years later and wonder, hey, who is this fool that wrote this code, until you look and you find that it's yourself. So any questions or anything while I go on mute and drink a little bit of tea? I waited 10 seconds and I didn't.
So, yeah. All right. So we do have some questions in the room,
Awesome.
and we have questions online. So we'll start with the questions in the room. So I'll repeat it just in case we don't hear it. But go ahead.
Okay. So question is, you mentioned that you reviewed or tested other technologies and they didn't work well. My question is, have you looked into server-side events? And if yes, why it didn't work, or maybe other technologies that you considered and they didn't work?
Server-side events, did I look into those? Can you be a bit more specific? I'm not sure that I understand what kind of server-side events you're thinking of.
It's probably server-side events, whatever. It's a standard one-way communication from server to browser.
Gotcha.
But all browsers support it out of the box. You don't have to have any libraries. You can just use basically plain JavaScript to work with that.
Yes, great question. We knew that our first use case was going to have to be our server or our C# code essentially telling the browser, hey, this is the person that is calling in. We also knew that there were other features that the business was planning that would require us to send other types of messages from one browser to another browser. So I suppose we might have been able to get away with doing kind of what you're describing, but because we wanted browser to browser and then C# to browser communication, we were like, well, we want one solution that does anything, that does everything anyway. So that WebSocket, although it did require us to include a bit more libraries on the front end, I don't think it substantially increased the amount of traffic that it took to, sort of bring the application online. So it kind of hit that sweet spot for us in fulfilling what we had now and then what we needed in the future. It was kind of both like the Mr. Right as well as Mr. Right now.
Does that answer your question or follow up?
Yeah, it makes sense. If they need like browser to browser communication too, that WebSockets will work with that.
Okay.
It was also nice too in that it allowed us to do messages to a specific client as well as messages to a group. So we could have our application roughly whatever screen they're on or whatever high level module they're on in the navigation, that could be a group. And as soon as they leave and they go and are viewing a different part of the application, they can unjoin, I think is the right verb, that group, and then the messages won't even be sent to them anymore. So it's nice in the fact that you only get messages and you only pay the penalty because, network traffic is a non-trivial cost. It's not like we suddenly live in the quantum computing age where we have, fiber optic cables that are all connecting us. So there is always a penalty in any network traffic, but it allows you to only receive traffic that is actually applicable to you, either from what groups you're a member of or messages sent to a specific client. So it was good enough and then good enough for the future.
Okay. So we have another question online. It looks similar to this one. I'll put it up on the screen. It's more around what are the other services you explored before deciding SignalR. You covered that pretty well, but I don't know if there's anything you want to wrap a bow on it with.
Yeah, some of those were specific more to Node.js. I think WS is one of those. Socket.io, I think, is one of those. So, we are primarily .NET developers. So it was like, do we really want to have to include Node.js just to be able to use this particular technology? Or do we want to have something where it's like, well, we already know and love C#, .NET Core, LTS, I kind of want to get that tattooed, on my knuckles, like .NET Core LTS. It's a great tool. And there's so many things. And it was just one or two niche use cases that we had to fulfill. So it's like, we got a tool that works well. We have something that Microsoft publishes out. Why not use it? Even if it's not even if it's not the coolest, even if all the cool kids aren't using it,
Okay. Is there any other questions online or in the room? I think we've covered all the questions that came in. There's a comment about WebSockets, but I'm not sure the context.
Yeah, uses WebSockets under the covers. So
okay.
It's fun. I mean, I used to use WebSockets back in the day before SignalR, and it wasn't as easy to do. So it abstracts the libraries that Microsoft publishes as NuGet packages, as well as on the front end, make it a lot easier to work with. It's maybe like 100 lines of code to get all that configuration in place. So it's honestly not that much compared to everything else that we end up doing on the C# side. So I wish it were simpler, just slightly simpler, but I'll take what I can get.
Sure. I think that pretty much covers it. I can make the presentation and link available when you have it for me. And
yeah, I'll send that out to you after this.
I think that covers it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you all very much for having me. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. And if you want to know more about how it is SignalR or any JavaScript gotchas, use the feedback link at the end. Send me, some constructive criticism only, nothing nasty. And yeah, we can be in touch. So I love to help. I live to serve, as my mom says.
All right, thank you. Well, it's a wrap, everyone. Thank you for attending. We're going to continue to have meetings in person and online, and I hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason.